no one called her name during the briefing. Outside the tent, beside an outdated aircraft scheduled for nothing, she waited unspoken, unnoticed, and still. Inside, mission leaders debated strategy as flight crews ran simulations and high-speed drops. Then the plan failed. Supplies scattered, routes collapsed, and every asset was grounded. All but one. When an unexpected transmission surfaced footage from a silent, low-altitude flight that should not have existed, every assumption shifted. And then everything changed. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story intrigues you, please consider subscribing to hear more untold stories of extraordinary service and the heroes who walk among us, never asking for the recognition they deserve. The tarmac pulsed with late heat as generators hummed and radios crackled along the open rows of transport aircraft. Pallets of water and ration packs sat shrink-wrapped in the shade of hastily pitched sun nets. A group of junior officers gathered near the mission board. Voices lifted in confident shorthand, half shouting over the sound of a taxiing jet. Every few minutes, someone pointed at the main screen, where relief drop corridors were cycling through satellite overlays. Major Dana Reese approached without ceremony, her boots powdered in dust, her sleeves rolled up past the elbow. In one hand she carried a folded flight map marked in pencil, its corners creased and soft from use. Her gloves hung from her belt loop, worn thin in the knuckle seams. She did not cut across the group. She waited, quiet, until the noise dipped low enough to be heard. Lieutenant Ryder saw her first. He leaned back against a supply crate, arms crossed, half a grin already forming. He was younger by a decade, with a flight vest too clean and a voice trained to sound casual while knowing it carried. He called out before she could speak, saying something about the old-timers still drawing their drop runs with crayons. A few of the others laughed. Dana didn't answer. She looked to the mission officer and held out her sheet. It was a valley thread drop plan. Low-altitude pass beneath radar choke points, with staggered chute release to compensate for terrain drag. She had calculated everything manually, verified against wind drift charts taped to her wall for the past 3 nights. The math was clean. The margins narrow. It could work. The officer glanced at the page, then glanced at Ryder. "We've got Ryder's plan locked," he said. "High-speed run, double altitude, safer." He tapped the board with the back of his marker. "We're not doing canyon weaves today." Dana didn't argue. She nodded once, took her plan back, and stepped aside. Ryder looked satisfied. He tossed his flight helmet into the crook of his arm, bumped fists with one of the other pilots, and said something about showtime. The decision was done in minutes. Crews were assigned, schedules locked. Dana's name didn't appear on the manifest screen. Someone called out across the lot, asking her to check with logistics and stand by for loading oversight. No one looked at her when they said it. By the time the mission briefing broke up, most of the crowd had moved toward the cooler tents. The sun was dropping lower, casting long lines across the gravel. Dana stood where she was for another moment. She didn't glance back at the others. She unfolded the map one more time, checked a number near the center margin, then folded it again, tighter this time. She slid it into her back pocket, dusted her gloves against her leg, and walked toward the edge of the field. Juliet 4 sat alone in the far row. The C-130 was unpainted, its hull streaked from a dozen seasons of heat and wind. One of the side access panels was still open, cables coiled neatly below. Dana climbed the short steps up into the bay and paused by the control rail. Her fingers hovered over a tie-down strap, adjusting it without urgency. No one was watching. The aircraft was not listed for today's operation. Behind her, a team of flight crew walked by without a word. They were laughing about something unrelated, their voices easy, already in motion. Dana stayed where she was, one foot on the ramp, gloves still at her belt, her weight balanced as if waiting for a command that hadn't come. She adjusted one dial on the rear bulkhead, more habit than instruction. No one called her name. No one asked where she was going. The map was still in her pocket, folded tight. Graphite faded from sweat and use. She looked once toward the sky, tracking the angle of sun off the ridge. Then she turned back to the aircraft and stepped fully inside, disappearing into shadow. The operations tent was packed tight with voices. A feed from the command tablet flickered onto the main screen, showing a slow drone orbit of the drop zone ridge. The terrain was jagged and narrow, dark rock faces running in a steep horseshoe around a sparse clearing. Wind data crawled along the edge of the frame. At the bottom, a red digital timestamp pulsed in real time. Lieutenant Ryder's C-130 cleared the first ridge like a showpiece, banking high and fast, sun flaring off the wings. Someone near the monitor let out a low whistle. Ryder's voice cut in over comms, cheerful and sharp, calling out altitude like a game. The flight officer standing behind the feedboard crossed his arms and nodded. Good angle. If he can thread it, this'll hit wide. Dana stood just outside the tent, watching through the clear panel. She didn't speak. The sky and the feed rolled gently as Ryder dipped toward the release mark. Inside the aircraft, cameras caught the crates moving down the rollers. Auto-release chutes blinked green. The drop was clean, visually precise, but seconds later the supply bundles drifted into view too shallow, blown wide by a cross-current, half-spun sideways. One chute failed to open entirely. Crates slammed down in scattered bursts against the rocks. The comms lit with clipped voices. Ground team operators radioed from cover, their tone shifting. Cargo down. Negative impact at marker. There was a pause. Then another voice. All pallets outside LZ. No recovery possible. Inside the tent, no one spoke. The flight officer leaned in, hands tightening against the tabletop. Repeat last. No pallets. The voice came again, dry with certainty. Nothing usable reached the enclave. Drop missed. The satellite feed zoomed in. Packages lay ruptured against the far edge of the canyon wall, some torn open, others jammed in crevices. Only one chute remained visible, fluttering in the wind like a warning. Julian Harrow stepped up behind the comm screen, jaw clenched. Run the drop data again. Check glide drift. Was it timing or terrain? Another officer muttered, margin was too thin. He pushed speed past buffer. Dana was already walking. Her boots scuffed quietly across the gravel behind the tents. No one called to her. She moved between shadows, past fuel drums and the stripped tail of an old cargo frame left for salvage. At the far edge of the field, Juliet 4 waited in silence. The Hercules looked like it had grown out of the concrete dull gray skin. Blunt frame, single maintenance tarp half folded across the port side. Dana climbed up the ramp without a word, her gloves still looped to her belt. Inside, the bay was quiet, faint smell of oil and dust in the heat. She laid her chart flat across the nearest stow bench and clipped it with a weight. She moved through systems by muscle memory, cabin pressure, fuel confirmation, auxiliary power. A clipboard lay beneath the throttle panel blank manifest, unsigned. She picked up a pen and filled it manually, marking her name, grid vector, and time in the top right corner. There was no mission number. Outside, a single junior technician crossed the tarmac, his gait uneven from heat fatigue. He spotted her on the ramp and raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, are you cleared?" Dana didn't look up from the instrument panel. "Doesn't matter. It's flyable." The technician hesitated. Then he nodded once and kept walking. She flipped the last switch, set the starter, and sat still for a beat as the systems came alive. The low whir turned to a rising thrum. Juliet 4 stirred like a sleeping animal. No one flagged her from the tower. No signal codes appeared on the sideboard. She opened the throttle with one clean motion and rolled toward the edge taxi line. On the far side of the airfield, the comms tent was still flooded with noise. Harrow shouted something about altitudes and override. Ryder's voice returned briefly. Clipped now. Conditions were wrong. Vectors shifted mid-drop. I adjusted. The feed screen rewound, frame by frame. Crates spiraled. The crowd leaned in closer. Dana reached the end of the strip, adjusted her trim manually, and keyed the flaps. Wind tugged at the edges of the hull, not strong enough to stop her. She pushed the throttle again. Juliet 4 accelerated smoothly. No calls came through her headset. The runway lights remained neutral. The tires lifted just before the halfway mark. The aircraft climbed into thickening cloud without ceremony. No call sign, no signature, no chatter. From the edge of the field, a refueling crew looked up briefly as the tail disappeared into fog. One of them blinked at the sound. "Was that 4?" someone asked. No one answered. Above them, Dana flew alone. The sky thickened fast as Dana crossed the outer boundary grid, the edge of the map folding into a terrain her instruments refused to read. Juliet 4 bucked slightly at the first shift of pressure. Not violent, but enough to remind her she was flying blind. She cut the autopilot feed and kept both hands on the yoke. No GPS, no signal return. Just muscle memory and the chart clipped beside her console, annotated in pencil, and rain wrinkled from a drill no one else remembered. The cloud base sank lower along the canyon edge. She dropped altitude without prompting, a 2-degree pitch that brought her inside the thermal envelope she'd calculated by hand 3 nights earlier. Wind battered the starboard flank in short, sharp bursts. Dana adjusted trim manually, inch by inch, until the aircraft settled again. The cockpit lights were dimmed all the way down. The only real brightness came from her cracked stopwatch duct-taped beside the altimeter, ticking in steady rhythm. Below, the valley narrowed. Rock faces clawed up from both sides, dark and jagged. Dana remembered them from the low-angle training sim that had been pulled for safety concerns. She'd run it anyway, memorized the eddies that rose on certain updrafts and the crosswinds that came out of the eastern break just before the final bend. She wasn't guessing. She was working off stored math and instinct. Juliet 4 rattled once as she dipped into the first cut between ridges. The clearance was tight, less than 50 meters to either wall. Wind shear hit again, this time harder, lifting the wing just off balance. Dana leaned against it with her grip. No overcorrection, just enough counterpressure to hold the line. One of the cockpit panels buzzed faintly, unsettled by the altitude shift. She ignored it. The next set of curves came faster. She banked through them with minimal flare, each movement deliberate. The aircraft groaned but held. Her eyes stayed ahead, watching light bleed through the canyon notches like warning signs. Every muscle in her arms was alert without strain. She didn't think. She just adjusted. In the cargo bay, the drop sequence waited. She had rigged the crates herself before dawn. Manual tie-downs, marked for single release. The chutes were old but reinforced. She had timed their release using descent curves plotted on the back of a ration packet. No sensors, no electronics, just angles and trust. Her voice stayed quiet as she keyed the internal trigger. Rear deploy armed, door unlocked. The cargo light turned amber. The approach straightened. It wouldn't last long. The drop zone was a pocket no wider than a soccer field, boxed in on 3 sides and partially obscured by canopy. Ryder's drop had failed because he came in too high and too straight. Dana aimed shallow and curved. The wind changed pitch again. Juliet 4 drifted 6 degrees left. Dana corrected on breath, not thought, and leveled as the trees gave way to clearing. The marker ridge flashed past her left wingtip. She hit the switch. From the back of the aircraft, the crates released in staggered sequence. Chutes opened with a ripple. Not quite symmetrical, but close enough. She held her altitude steady for a count of 5, then adjusted throttle and began to climb. There was no cheer, no voice in her ear, only the weight of steel and noise and the rush of air as the aircraft cleared the drop. Then, something blinked red on the corner of the thermal overlay. A flare signature, faint but deliberate, pulsed on the upper left quadrant tucked just inside a ridge Dana hadn't planned to fly over. It wasn't natural. It was shaped heat, controlled. A checkpoint. She tapped the record command on her backup screen. The image locked and stored without alert. No reaction crossed her face. She had no time for interpretation. She banked again, higher now, riding the retreating thermals out of the valley in a wide arc, designed to mask her engine noise against the upper layer. Juliet 4 climbed slowly, engines straining but unbroken. The sky lightened slightly on the eastern edge. Dana leaned forward and scanned her instruments by feel, not for validation, but for pacing. The fuel was on margin. The pressure gauge had dipped just under nominal. She made a small adjustment to the cabin seal and let the rest sit. The ridge slipped behind her like a folded page. Below, the chutes were still drifting, bright against the green cut of forest. She didn't watch them land. She reached for her map, flipped it to the return vector, and set the timer on her stopwatch. Juliet 4 leveled out and flew home in silence. Juliet 4 touched down with a low groan as the tires met gravel at the southern edge of the airstrip. The sky was still gray from the storm belt she had pierced on return, though the cloud ceiling was starting to lift. No lights greeted the approach. No ground crew flagged her into position. Dana eased the aircraft to a smooth stop along the auxiliary pad, where empty shells of retired birds rusted quietly behind rows of wire fencing. She powered down by habit. The engines ticked and cooled. She reached for her clipboard and filled in her flight log with a grease-smudged pen. No printed block, no digital entry, just her own initials, altitude range, grid vector, and drop confirmation handwritten across the blank white. She signed the bottom corner without pausing, tore the sheet loose, and tucked it into the bay's service panel where tech logs were stored out of sight. Then she climbed down alone. The heat had broken, but dust still lifted under her boots as she crossed back toward the main hangars. Her gloves were still clipped to her belt. Her sleeves were streaked with oil at the forearm where the backup panel had jammed on descent. She didn't clean it. Didn't speak. No one looked her way as she passed under the comms line, turned into the side entrance, and slipped back toward the shadows of the east wing. Inside the command tent, the air was louder. Ryder stood in the center of the screen bank, arms gesturing to the topographic projection still glowing on the wall. He was animated, frustrated, pointing at an elevation curve and tracing a glide arc with 2 fingers. "I adjusted for wind vector at marker 27, he said, louder than needed. The terrain shifted faster than expected. Cross-drift was outside predicted bands. No drop system could have held precision under those offsets." A logistics officer leaned over the table with narrowed eyes. "Then why did you override altitude? We had 100.0 as the line. You came in at 122 and accelerated." "Because terrain dictated it," Ryder snapped. "I chose survivability over speculation. If I had followed her canyon curve, I'd be scraping debris off my tail." No one mentioned Dana's name aloud, but the implication sat between them. Around the edge of the table, junior staff tapped tablets, updated charts, reloaded glide maps. A low hum of procedural triage filled the room. Julian Harrow stepped back from the screen with a sigh. "There's no time to redrop. The ridge corridor is closed until satellite confirms visual. And the only other bird with enough clearance is—" He trailed off, frowning. Someone leaned in from the side. Juliet 4 was parked. A younger analyst stepped into the tent holding a small device, clearly unsure whether to interrupt. "Sir," she said, directing it toward the logistics console. "We just got a feed. From the ridge outpost. Local camera relay. Someone patched the line through." The officer clicked it live. The image came slowly, grainy at first, then sharper as the connection stabilized. A child stood near the edge of a rock path, barefoot, dragging a white-wrapped crate toward a clearing. Behind her, adults moved across the zone lifting packages, opening chutes, setting supplies in rough stacks. Another child waved at the camera. The crate bore a stenciled letter and timestamp. Juliet 4. Dana's handwriting was visible, marked in graphite near the panel hinge. The tent went silent. Every person turned toward the screen. The comms feeds dropped in volume. The wind outside caught the edge of the canvas, flapping once. Even Ryder's voice stopped mid-sentence. In the background of the video feed, the tail of a C-130 cleared the ridge, not descending, already climbing. The shape was unmistakable. Julian moved toward the board. Who authorized that flight? No one answered. The logistics assistant pulled up the manifest again, fingers moving fast. She checked twice, then looked up. Juliet 4 isn't listed. No log, no call sign. She's off the board. A long pause. Ryder stepped forward, visibly uncertain. That's not possible. That bird was cold. No clearance, no nav team. She doesn't even... The sentence collapsed on itself. A captain at the back of the tent glanced between the screen and the data tablet. So, who flew that drop? The reply came quietly, almost confused. It's not on the manifest. The feed continued to play. Soundless now. Wind stirred the frame. Children carried food out of the brush, and Juliet 4 disappeared over the far side of the valley, never banking back. The room had shifted. Tables once stacked with secondary supply maps were cleared and pushed toward the corners. Screens dominated the center now, 3 wide and 1 tall, casting a pale glow across the carpet. An image held at the center paused mid-frame, showed a faint red bloom radiating from the base of a rocky ledge. It pulsed slightly, irregular in shape, but distinct. No one spoke as it hung there. A technician stood at the corner terminal, tablet in hand, confirming the timestamp with the satellite sync. Frame matches field relay at 1652. Thermal match pattern confirmed by Intel sweep. Julian Harrow crossed his arms slowly, stepping toward the screen. His voice had dropped since the chaos earlier. You're saying that heat return didn't come from our asset? The tech nodded once. Correct. We matched the anomaly against our archived band patterns. Shape, residual signature, spread pattern, they all line up with a mobile generator nest. Not ours. Likely a radar-linked battery. Camouflaged. Possibly part of the old checkpoint structure we thought was abandoned. Another officer leaned in from the table, voice tight. We missed that entire shelf. The intel liaison standing nearest the main screen added quietly. Until now. At the edge of the room, Lieutenant Ryder shifted in place. His arms were crossed too tightly now, his knuckles white against his sleeves. And that feed came from where exactly? The tech looked down, swiped the tablet again, and answered without glancing up. Tail camera, C-130 Juliet 4, rear-facing thermal overlay during outbound vector. There was a brief pause. Ryder spoke first. Juliet 4 wasn't in the air. No one confirmed or denied it. The feed resumed at half speed. The image tilted slightly as the aircraft gained altitude. The heat signature bloomed again for 2 frames, then began to fade. The coordinates stamped to the right updated in real time. From the hallway beyond the tent, footsteps approached, measured, unhurried. Dana stepped through the flap with her gloves still clipped at her belt and a folded paper tucked in her hand. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. She moved to the far side of the room where the second monitor tracked flight elevation patterns. Her shadow stretched briefly across the table as she passed. Ryder turned halfway toward her, confusion shifting to irritation. She wasn't cleared. That bird didn't even have uplink clearance yesterday. A logistics officer leaned over the log display. There's no flight entry on record, no dispatch, no radio trail. She's not on the grid. Another voice behind him, cooler now, said, but she was in the air. Julian stepped forward and didn't ask her to explain. Instead, he pointed at the paused frame on the screen. You recorded this. Dana nodded once. He waited, then asked, Did you know what you were seeing? She stepped closer, unfolded the paper in her hand, and laid it flat across the edge of the table. It was a flight sheet, folded 4 times, graphite worn down along the creases, numbers tight along the margins. Terrain marks ran in precise arcs beside wind speed notations. One corner showed a sketched thermal band. She tapped it lightly with one finger. There was a flicker against the ridge during climb-out. It was too regular for heat shadow. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't belong. No embellishment, no apology. Ryder's voice carried again. That's not a protocol-confirmed assessment. It's a guess. Dana looked at him once and replied with no emotion in her tone. It was a calculation. The intelligence officer who had been silent until now stepped forward. It's accurate. We just confirmed it against drone footage from last month. The site was cold then. It's active now. Someone at the map table exhaled audibly, so she caught it in motion. Live. Another added, that position overlooks Corridor 5 and Marker Delta. If that's a working battery, it's been watching our entire convoy route without us knowing. Julian turned back to the table, placed both hands flat on the edge, and stared at the datasheet. His voice didn't rise. This changes the ground picture. Dana didn't move. Ryder looked between them, frustration tightening again. You're going to pivot strategy based on an unauthorized drop. A senior officer in the back answered for him. We're going to pivot strategy based on the only accurate data we've seen in the last 24 hours. Juliet 4's feed looped again. This time, side by side with the regional map. The red bloom of the checkpoint became a fixed coordinate. Markers adjusted in real time. The air control officer lifted his comms mic and began issuing new vector advisories. Someone updated the mission board. Juliet 4's call sign, previously blank, now read Recovered Intel Level 1. Priority. Dana stepped away from the table. She said nothing else. She didn't ask for validation. But the room had already changed. A junior analyst walked over slowly, holding the edge of her data printout. He wasn't smiling, but his voice had softened. You did all this by hand. She nodded once. He looked back at the screen. You just rewrote the grid. By morning, the footage had spread. It started on the smaller terminals, 2 in the flight prep bay, 1 in the auxiliary comms office, and a shared monitor just outside logistics. The file didn't carry a name. No watermark. No orders attached. It simply began playing on loop, showing the uncut footage from Juliet 4's mission. The valley opened in the foreground, early morning haze still clinging to the tree line. Then came the shadow of the aircraft banking low, its engines just audible under the wind. Crates deployed in clean succession, chutes flaring with even rhythm, each release aligned to terrain curvature. No dramatic music, no call-outs, just flight, just work done right. By the time it reached the main feed wall in the mess tent, 5 squadrons had already viewed it in parts. Flight crews stood watching now between debriefings and chow lines, pausing in their movements, caught mid-motion by the steadiness of it all. No one said much. They didn't have to. Dana entered the room from the back, her boots quiet against the floor tiles. Tessa spotted her first and crossed over quickly. She held a sealed folder in one hand. Her voice was soft. They reclassified your asset, she said. Juliet 4 is marked as mission priority now. You've been assigned to lead Relief Grid 5. Dana accepted the folder without reaction. The cover was marked with a fresh seal and the letterhead of Central Operations. Inside, her own name appeared at the top, this time listed under the column for lead aircrew. Tessa didn't linger. She gave a small nod and stepped back toward the logistics table. Dana looked once toward the screen. The footage had looped again. This time it played from the interior camera her cockpit view during final approach. The instrument panel glowed faintly. Wind rocked the fuselage. Her hand adjusted trim and throttle in steady increments. Nothing rushed. No fear. Just her and the map clipped to the frame. Someone nearby leaned toward the screen, pointing softly. That's manual calibration, they said. She wasn't even flying with auto trim. Another answered, she must have plotted the wind zones by hand. The voices weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Ryder passed behind them. He had a tray in one hand, half forgotten. His pace slowed as he caught sight of the screen, his posture shifting. He didn't speak, didn't move closer. He just watched as Juliet 4 pulled up clean through the cloud seam, vanishing into sun glare. Dana didn't approach him. She turned instead and walked toward the far corner of the tent, where her gloves rested on the edge of a service bench. As she picked them up, the volume on the screen dipped. A crew member stepped forward, scanning the flight sheet visible in the footage. Who cleared that drop, he asked aloud. not to anyone in particular. A second voice, older, responded without turning from the screen. She didn't wait to be cleared. Dana stepped out of the tent and into the light. The airfield was different now. The same aircraft sat in formation, and the same fuel carts rolled between hangars. But the energy had shifted. No one looked away when she passed. A few nodded. A few more stood back, letting her path remain unobstructed. The sun had risen higher than the day before, and the heat carried a stillness that wasn't just weather. Dana moved across the tarmac toward Juliet 4, now parked in the primary loading zone. Its access panels were closed, cleaned, and relabeled with mission stamps. A ground team stood nearby reviewing a manifest. One turned as she approached. "Morning, ma'am," he said without hesitation. "We've got pallets lined for takeoff in 30. We were told you'd want eyes on the flight config." She nodded once, climbed the ramp, and stepped into the aircraft she had rebuilt with her own hands. Inside, the cargo bay was cool and clean. The roller system had been re-oiled. Her old chart was still tucked under the corner brace. No one had moved it. She crouched to check the rigging line, fingers trailing the steel as if testing memory. Then she stood, walked forward, and entered the cockpit. The panel lit under her hand. No alerts, no warnings. Behind her, the airfield moved like a river adjusted. Not louder, just steadier. At the main mission board, Juliet 4's call sign glowed on the top row. Status read, "Active priority." No questions listed below. As Dana re-emerged, stepping down the ramp with her gloves now in hand, a path opened across the edge of the staging line. Crews parted without being told. No one saluted. No one announced her name over the speaker. But when she passed, they stepped aside. She didn't walk faster. She didn't look back. The same gravel shifted under her boots, but this time it didn't bite. This time, it felt like forward motion. She reached the line, opened her orders, and climbed back into her seat. And no one not command, not the crews, not the pilot who once laughed dared question what she had become. You just witnessed the story of a woman who was told to wait, to step aside, to leave the work to others. But instead of arguing or demanding recognition, she prepared in silence. She trusted her experience. She flew anyway. And when everything else failed, it was her steady hand and forgotten math that delivered the supplies, revealed the threat, and shifted the mission itself. This was not a story about proving anyone wrong. It was about remembering who you are, even when no one else does. About showing up with clarity, not noise. Quiet strength leaves a deeper mark than any spotlight ever could. What part of this journey spoke to you the most? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in stories like this about dignity, service, and the power of being underestimated, follow for more. There are many still to tell.